Senator, as referenced earlier in some questioning during the hearing today, the weaponization working group as commissioned by the president.
A simple yes or no would do. Were you part of the weaponization working group?
Senator, as I referenced earlier in questions before the panel, the weaponization working group as commissioned by the president and then the attorney general
I still haven't gotten an answer. Were you involved with the weaponization working group, yes or no? It's a simple question. You were either involved with it or you weren't.
Senator, as referenced earlier.
You either answer the question, Mr. McDonald, or you admit to this committee that you believe some people at the Department of Justice operate above the very manual they swore to uphold, Schiff said, his voice steady but cutting, forcing the room into a silence that felt heavier than any shouting match could have produced. Almost immediately, viewers began asking why Schiff chose to escalate so bluntly over what appeared to be a procedural yes or no inquiry, and whether that intensity reflected genuine oversight or calculated political theater. If you are wondering why such a direct confrontation unfolded over something as seemingly technical as adherence to the Justice Department manual, stay with this entire breakdown, because the answer lies not in the wording of the question, but in the strategy behind it. In my professional assessment, this was not a spontaneous outburst, but a carefully constructed pressure tactic designed to corner a witness into clarity, knowing that refusal to provide a direct answer would create a narrative more powerful than the answer itself. What unfolded between Schiff and McDonald was less about a working group and more about whether oversight in Washington still has teeth, or whether it dissolves into bureaucratic fog the moment real accountability is implied. Schiff's line of questioning was deceptively simple, because he repeatedly framed the issue around a straightforward yes or no inquiry about whether members of a DOJ working group were required to abide by the department's own manual. On its surface, the question seemed almost trivial, yet anyone familiar with congressional oversight understands that simplicity is often a trap, because a direct answer locks a witness into a definable position. McDonald, for his part, consistently referenced prior testimony instead of delivering the requested binary response, which only heightened the tension in the room and on the screens of those watching. Schiff recognized that hesitation, and rather than broadening the scope of his questioning, he narrowed it further, repeating the question with surgical precision in a manner reminiscent of courtroom cross-examination. The strategic objective was unmistakable, because forcing a witness to avoid a yes or no question about ethical obligations plants a seed of doubt without ever alleging misconduct directly. McDonald's response strategy reflected a different calculation entirely, because instead of conceding to the framing, he attempted to contextualize the working group within broader departmental operations. By invoking the structure and authority under which the working group was established, he sought to diffuse the insinuation that it operated outside normal ethical boundaries. From a communications standpoint, that move can be effective in long-form testimony. Yet, in a high-profile hearing environment, it risks appearing evasive when a lawmaker demands brevity. Schiff capitalized on that dynamic immediately, suggesting that reluctance to answer a simple question invites suspicion about whether the standards of the Justice Manual were uniformly applied. At that moment, the clash transcended procedure and entered the realm of perception, because optics began to outweigh technical explanation. The most fascinating element of this exchange was how each man understood the power of repetition differently. Schiff repeated the question not because he lacked clarity, but because repetition increases pressure, especially when cameras are rolling and the public expects decisiveness. McDonald repeated references to prior testimony because consistency signals composure, particularly for career officials who avoid impulsive phrasing. In effect, both were repeating strategically, but for entirely different audiences. Schiff was speaking to voters who distrust bureaucratic ambiguity, while McDonald was speaking to institutional culture that values cautious precision. There is an uncomfortable but necessary question embedded in this confrontation that deserves honest reflection. When a witness avoids a direct answer in a congressional hearing, does that inherently signal concealment? Or does it reflect legal discipline in a politically charged setting? Conversely, when a lawmaker insists on a yes or no format, does that reflect clarity seeking, or does it risk oversimplifying complex bureaucratic realities? These questions are not rhetorical theatrics, because they shape how Americans interpret oversight as either legitimate inquiry or partisan spectacle. Schiff clearly believed that reducing the exchange to yes or no terms would expose either accountability or avoidance, and that belief drove his insistence. McDonald's refusal to conform to that structure suggested a different instinct, namely that reducing internal policy frameworks to binary answers could misrepresent the operational nuance of the department. Yet nuance is rarely rewarded in modern political discourse, particularly when viral clips circulate stripped of context. Schiff likely anticipated that dynamic, which explains why he repeatedly emphasized the simplicity of the question itself. By labeling the inquiry as simple, he implied that any refusal to answer directly must stem from unwillingness rather than complexity. That rhetorical move is subtle but powerful, because it reframes evasion as a conscious choice rather than procedural caution. There was even a moment of restrained irony when Schiff remarked that he was not interested in prior references, but in a present answer, drawing quiet recognition from observers familiar with how hearings often drift into monologues. McDonald maintained composure, reiterating that all department employees operate within established ethical frameworks, effectively broadening the answer without submitting to the demanded phrasing. Schiff interpreted that broadening as avoidance, pressing further by asking whether he had ever observed violations within the working group itself. That escalation shifted the tone from policy compliance to implied conduct, though Schiff carefully avoided making any explicit accusation. The distinction matters, because implication can be politically potent without crossing into direct allegation. Another controversial question emerges here that viewers must confront honestly. Should a lawmaker publicly imply institutional wrongdoing when a witness declines to answer in the preferred format, even if no concrete evidence of misconduct is presented? Or is such implication a legitimate tactic designed to compel transparency in environments where bureaucratic language shields uncomfortable truths? Schiff's supporters would argue that aggressive oversight deters misuse of power by forcing public accountability. McDonald's defenders would argue that disciplined testimony protects the department from politicized narratives that distort lawful activity. What became evident as the exchange progressed is that neither man was improvising. Schiff's cadence reflected a prosecutor's instinct to corner a witness with limited escape routes. McDonald's measured responses reflected a career official's instinct to avoid rhetorical traps that could be misconstrued outside full context. The friction between those instincts created the drama. Yet the underlying disagreement was philosophical rather than personal. One side prioritized visible confrontation, while the other prioritized procedural insulation. As the chairman declined to intervene and assist in extracting a direct answer, the power dynamics shifted subtly. Schiff noted the absence of enforcement with thinly veiled frustration, suggesting that refusal to answer would speak for itself. McDonald remained consistent, neither escalating nor conceding, relying instead on the credibility of institutional continuity. The audience, divided along ideological lines, interpreted the silence differently depending on pre-existing trust in either Congress or the Department of Justice. And that interpretive divide may ultimately matter more than the exchange itself. If you have watched political hearings long enough, you know that moments like this often become symbolic shorthand for broader narratives about weaponization, accountability, and the separation of powers. Whether Schiff succeeded in exposing ambiguity or merely amplified suspicion depends on your expectations of oversight. Whether McDonald demonstrated discipline or evasiveness depends on your expectations of executive branch independence. What cannot be denied is that the exchange illuminated the tension between legislative scrutiny and bureaucratic self-defense in a way few procedural sessions ever do. If you want to understand how this confrontation evolves into a larger battle over narrative control and institutional legitimacy, stay through the next segment, because the strategic stakes are only beginning to reveal themselves. As the exchange moved into its second phase, the temperature in the room did not cool so much as it sharpened, because Schiff had already established the frame and McDonald had already chosen his defensive posture. What followed was not louder, but more deliberate, and in some ways more revealing than the initial clash over the yes or no question. Schiff understood that once a witness refuses to conform to a binary answer, the next step is not repetition for repetition's sake, but escalation through implication. McDonald, equally aware of the optics, doubled down on procedural language rather than emotional reaction, signaling that he would not be drawn into rhetorical traps. This is where the real political chess game began. Schiff pivoted slightly, shifting from whether members of the working group were bound by the Justice Department manual to whether ethical compliance within that group was subject to independent verification. It was a subtle but significant shift, because now the issue was not simply adherence to written standards, but accountability mechanisms that ensure those standards are followed. McDonald responded by reiterating that all department employees are required to comply with established ethical frameworks, emphasizing universality rather than specificity. Schiff immediately seized on that universality, arguing that if compliance is universal, then confirming it should be straightforward and uncontroversial. The repetition of that logical loop created mounting pressure without a single explicit accusation. Here is the controversial question that hovered just beneath the surface of the exchange. If a government working group is formed under presidential authority and operates within the Department of Justice, should Congress have full confidence that its actions are insulated from political influence, or should that confidence be earned through visible transparency? Schiff's posture suggested that visible reassurance was necessary because public trust has been eroded by past controversies. McDonald's posture suggested that public trust must be grounded in structural safeguards rather than theatrical affirmations. The friction between those positions reveals the broader ideological tension shaping the hearing. There was a telling moment when Schiff remarked that reluctance to provide a direct answer creates more questions than it resolves, drawing a faint stir among observers. McDonald responded that clarity sometimes requires contextual framing rather than abbreviated responses, maintaining a tone that was steady but unmistakably firm. Schiff interpreted that contextual framing as deflection, while McDonald likely viewed Schiff's insistence as reductive. Neither characterization is entirely fair nor entirely inaccurate, which is precisely why the exchange resonated so strongly. Politics often thrives in the gray space between those interpretations. At this stage, it is important to recognize that Schiff's strategy was not necessarily about extracting a confession of wrongdoing, but about creating a moment that underscored his vigilance. By pressing repeatedly for a direct affirmation of ethical compliance, he positioned himself as a defender of institutional standards rather than an accuser of specific misconduct. McDonald's resistance to the binary framing, meanwhile, allowed him to present himself as a protector of procedural nuance rather than a figure dodging accountability. Both men were conscious of how their demeanor would be interpreted beyond the hearing room, and both were playing to audiences who evaluate tone as much as substance. Another uncomfortable but necessary question emerges here. When lawmakers compress complex bureaucratic processes into yes or no formats for the sake of clarity, does that enhance democratic understanding, or does it oversimplify institutional reality? Conversely, when officials respond with layered contextual explanations instead of concise answers, does that protect accuracy, or does it obscure responsibility? The tension between those approaches is not unique to this hearing, but this exchange placed it under a spotlight. Schiff's approach favored clarity through compression. McDonald's approach favored accuracy through expansion. The most politically charged moment of this segment arrived when Schiff suggested that reluctance to confirm adherence to the Justice Manual could lead observers to suspect that the working group operated under different rules. That line did not accuse, but it implied, and implication in congressional hearings carries substantial weight. McDonald declined to validate that implication, reiterating that all employees are bound by departmental standards, yet still resisting the direct yes or no formulation. From a communications perspective, this was a high-risk standoff for both sides. If Schiff pushed too hard, he risked appearing theatrical. If McDonald continued to avoid brevity, he risked appearing evasive. There was even a brief flicker of restrained humor when Schiff observed that the question seemed simpler than the answer being offered, prompting a ripple of restrained laughter. McDonald maintained composure, responding that simplicity in phrasing does not eliminate complexity in governance. That exchange captured the philosophical divide more succinctly than any extended argument. Schiff was appealing to public instinct. McDonald was appealing to institutional tradition. By the time this segment concluded, the narrative had shifted from a single unanswered question to a broader debate about how oversight should function in a polarized era. Schiff had successfully cast doubt on the clarity of the working group's operational transparency, even without alleging specific violations. McDonald had successfully reinforced his commitment to departmental norms without conceding to rhetorical compression. The room remained divided, but the stakes had grown larger than a procedural inquiry. They now touched on fundamental questions about separation of powers and institutional legitimacy. If you are watching this and wondering which approach better safeguards democratic accountability, I encourage you to think beyond the immediate clash and consider the long-term implications of each strategy. Do you prefer oversight that prioritizes visible confrontation, even if nuance is sacrificed? Or do you prefer testimony that preserves procedural depth, even if clarity feels delayed? Your answer to that question shapes how hearings like this influence public confidence in government institutions. If you value detailed, balanced analysis that moves beyond partisan framing and examines the mechanics of power itself, subscribe and engage in the discussion below, because the next phase of this debate reveals even deeper strategic maneuvering between Schiff and McDonald that you will not want to miss. By the time the third stage of the confrontation unfolded, the exchange between Schiff and McDonald had moved beyond surface-level procedural tension and into something more consequential, because now the question was no longer simply whether a working group followed a manual, but whether public trust could survive ambiguous testimony. Schiff appeared increasingly aware that repetition alone would not advance his objective, so he adjusted his approach toward drawing broader implications from McDonald's reluctance to provide a direct affirmation. McDonald, for his part, maintained his measured cadence, relying on institutional language that projected composure even as pressure mounted around him. The contrast between sharp legislative interrogation and disciplined bureaucratic restraint became more pronounced with every passing minute. And in that contrast, the political subtext became impossible to ignore. Schiff began reframing the issue not merely as a matter of internal compliance, but as a matter of equal standards applied consistently across administrations, subtly invoking broader debates about political neutrality without stating them outright. He suggested that when the department establishes specialized working groups under presidential direction, the public deserves reassurance that those groups operate under the same ethical boundaries as every other unit. McDonald responded by reiterating that departmental standards are not optional frameworks, but binding obligations for all personnel, again broadening rather than narrowing the answer. From Schiff's perspective, that broadness diluted accountability because it failed to directly confirm that the specific working group in question adhered to the same rulebook. From McDonald's perspective, specificity risked mischaracterization, particularly in a hearing environment primed for political interpretation. At this juncture, one cannot avoid confronting a critical question that transcends the individuals involved. When congressional oversight presses for direct confirmation of ethical compliance, should witnesses adapt to the political format for the sake of clarity? Or should they remain anchored to institutional language, even if it frustrates lawmakers? Schiff's insistence implied that clarity is a democratic virtue in itself, because ambiguity can breed suspicion even where no misconduct exists. McDonald's restraint implied that procedural integrity must not bend to rhetorical compression, especially when legal nuance could be distorted outside full context. Both positions carry internal logic, and that is precisely why the exchange felt so charged. There was a subtle escalation when Schiff pivoted to questions about grand jury material and adherence to secrecy rules, moving from abstract compliance to specific areas of legal sensitivity. The shift was strategic because referencing grand jury secrecy carries inherent gravity without requiring direct allegation. McDonald maintained his composure, referring to prior testimony and reiterating that departmental operations are governed by established legal standards. Schiff responded with visible frustration, suggesting that repeated references to earlier answers were becoming indistinguishable from refusal. That exchange intensified the perception that something consequential lay beneath the surface, even though no explicit claim of wrongdoing was made. Here is another controversial but necessary question that viewers must consider honestly. Does a witness's refusal to answer in the demanded format create a reasonable inference of concealment? Or does it merely reflect disciplined adherence to internal protocol? Conversely, does a lawmaker's insistence on a direct answer demonstrate courage? Or does it risk oversimplifying matters that require layered explanation? These are not abstract academic questions because they shape how the public interprets oversight hearings across administrations and political cycles. Schiff clearly believed that narrowing the exchange to direct affirmations would reveal either compliance or discomfort. McDonald appeared to believe that stepping into that narrow framing would compromise the integrity of his testimony, even if it satisfied the optics of clarity. The standoff thus became less about the specific working group and more about how power branches negotiate their respective roles in public view. Schiff's repeated invocation of the Justice Manual served as a symbolic anchor, reminding observers that written standards exist to prevent selective application of authority. McDonald's repeated reference to institutional structure served as a counter-anchor, reminding observers that written standards operate within broader operational realities. The tension between symbolism and structure defined the heart of the confrontation. There was even a moment of restrained irony when Schiff suggested that the question should not be more complicated than confirming whether rules apply equally, prompting a quiet stir among those present. McDonald answered with steady calm, stating that rules do apply equally, though once again avoiding the yes or no construction that Schiff demanded. The repetition of that pattern deepened the divide rather than resolving it. Schiff leaned into the perception that avoidance signaled discomfort. McDonald leaned into the perception that measured repetition signaled professionalism. By this point, the audience was no longer listening solely for substance, but for tone and posture. Schiff's body language projected impatience with bureaucratic hedging, reinforcing his identity as an aggressive overseer. McDonald's posture projected institutional steadiness, reinforcing his identity as a guardian of procedural discipline. Neither appeared rattled, yet neither conceded ground either. And in Washington, refusal to concede often matters more than victory itself. As the chairman declined to intervene decisively, Schiff made a pointed observation that the absence of a direct answer would speak for itself, subtly shifting responsibility for public interpretation onto the witness. McDonald responded by emphasizing that the working group's mandate involved reviewing historic concerns, redirecting attention toward its broader mission rather than internal compliance details. That reframing was strategic because it sought to move the conversation away from defensive posture and toward proactive purpose. Schiff interpreted it as diversion, reinforcing his earlier implication that clarity was being withheld. The clash of narratives hardened as the segment drew to a close. What this stage ultimately revealed is that the dispute was not about whether ethical standards exist, but about how visibly and explicitly those standards are affirmed in moments of scrutiny. Schiff sought explicit affirmation as a means of reinforcing public confidence. McDonald sought institutional framing as a means of preserving procedural integrity. The disagreement was philosophical, yet its impact was political. And the ramifications of that philosophical divide extend far beyond one hearing room. If you have followed this analysis carefully, you can see that what appears to be a simple question about a manual is in fact a debate about how transparency functions in a polarized democracy. Ask yourself whether you believe oversight is most effective when it compresses answers into clear binaries, or when it preserves nuance even at the cost of immediate clarity. Your response to that question likely determines which side of this confrontation resonates more strongly with you. Engage in the discussion below and share your perspective respectfully, because democratic institutions depend not only on confrontation, but on informed civic reflection. Stay tuned for the next phase, where the strategic consequences of this exchange begin to ripple beyond the hearing itself and into broader narratives about the balance between legislative scrutiny and executive discretion. As the fourth phase of the confrontation unfolded, the dynamic between Schiff and McDonald evolved from pointed interrogation into a broader struggle over narrative ownership. Because by this stage, both men understood that the public interpretation of their exchange would matter more than the literal wording of any single answer. Schiff no longer needed to repeat the same question in the same form, because the absence of a direct affirmation had already created the rhetorical space he sought to highlight. McDonald, meanwhile, appeared increasingly comfortable relying on institutional language, confident that consistency would project steadiness rather than hesitation. The tension did not explode outward, but it deepened, becoming less theatrical and more philosophical with each passing exchange. This is often how consequential political moments unfold, not in shouts, but in controlled persistence. Schiff pivoted toward the broader implications of accountability, emphasizing that oversight exists precisely because institutions can drift when left unchecked by external scrutiny. He framed his insistence not as partisan antagonism, but as a constitutional safeguard designed to prevent any perception of selective enforcement. McDonald responded by reinforcing that safeguards are embedded within the department's own internal review structures, suggesting that the working group operated under layers of oversight rather than outside them. Schiff seized on that reference to internal review, arguing that public reassurance cannot rely solely on self-monitoring when public trust is already strained. The disagreement was no longer about a manual alone, but about whether internal systems are sufficient in an era of deep political skepticism. A particularly revealing moment emerged when Schiff suggested that public perception of fairness is almost as important as fairness itself, because legitimacy in democratic institutions depends on visible neutrality. MacDonald countered that legitimacy must be anchored in adherence to law rather than performance for the sake of optics, subtly cautioning against conflating political pressure with ethical obligation. This exchange crystallized the divide in a way that transcended the specific working group under discussion. Schiff's argument leaned into transparency as reassurance. MacDonald's argument leaned into process as reassurance. Here is the difficult question that continues to hover over the exchange. In a polarized climate where trust in federal institutions has eroded, is it enough for officials to assert compliance with internal standards? Or must they demonstrate that compliance through explicit affirmation under public questioning? Schiff's posture implied that public affirmation strengthens credibility. MacDonald's posture implied that affirmation without context can oversimplify and potentially mislead. Both perspectives reveal legitimate concerns about how power is exercised and perceived. There was a restrained flash of humor when Schiff remarked that clarity should not require a decoder ring, a line that drew a ripple of muted laughter from observers who recognized the frustration embedded in that comment. MacDonald responded with measured composure, stating that clarity and precision are not always identical concepts in legal governance. The exchange did not devolve into hostility, yet it underscored the persistent friction between legislative urgency and executive restraint. Schiff pressed from the standpoint of public accountability. MacDonald resisted from the standpoint of institutional caution. As the questioning continued, Schiff raised the broader theme of equal application of rules across administrations, careful not to accuse, but deliberate in signaling that political neutrality must be visible. MacDonald reiterated that departmental standards do not fluctuate with political leadership, reinforcing his consistent message that ethical frameworks bind all personnel equally. The repetition from both sides served different purposes, because Schiff sought to highlight unresolved ambiguity, while MacDonald sought to normalize continuity. Observers could see that neither intended to concede rhetorical ground. The standoff had become symbolic rather than procedural. Another important question emerges for anyone watching carefully. When oversight hearings emphasize perception and tone as much as legal substance, do they strengthen democratic transparency or risk amplifying suspicion without resolution? Schiff's strategy relied on the belief that public doubt must be confronted openly. MacDonald's strategy relied on the belief that institutional stability requires resisting public doubt until facts justify action. The hearing illuminated how those philosophies collide in real time. As the chairman signaled that time was nearly exhausted, Schiff delivered a pointed closing remark, suggesting that reluctance to provide direct affirmation leaves lingering questions that only further transparency can resolve. MacDonald concluded by reaffirming that departmental employees operate within binding ethical frameworks and that the working group's purpose was rooted in review rather than retaliation. Neither statement resolved the tension, yet both clarified the contours of the disagreement. Schiff left the exchange having reinforced his role as a vigilant overseer, unwilling to accept ambiguity. MacDonald left having reinforced his role as a disciplined official, unwilling to collapse complex governance into binary sound bites. If you are evaluating this exchange solely through partisan instinct, I encourage you to pause and examine the deeper structural issues it reveals. Oversight and executive function are meant to operate in tension, because democratic resilience depends on both scrutiny and restraint. Ask yourself which instinct you prioritize when watching hearings like this, and whether that instinct is shaped by principle or by political alignment. Engage in the conversation respectfully and thoughtfully in the comments below, because meaningful civic dialogue requires more than cheering for one side. If you value in-depth analysis that dissects the mechanics of power without sensationalism, subscribe and share this discussion with others who care about how constitutional checks and balances function in practice, because the next stage of this debate explores the long-term strategic consequences of this confrontation and what it signals for future oversight battles. By the time this confrontation reached its fifth stage, what had begun as a procedural clash had matured into a referendum on institutional credibility itself, because neither Schiff nor McDonald was speaking solely to each other anymore. They were speaking to the country watching from living rooms, offices, and news feeds across a deeply divided political landscape. Schiff understood that repetition alone would no longer generate momentum, so he broadened his framing to emphasize patterns rather than isolated answers, suggesting that transparency must be consistent rather than situational. McDonald remained measured, carefully threading the needle between acknowledging oversight authority and resisting what he clearly perceived as reductive interrogation tactics. The hearing room had grown quieter, not because tension had dissipated, but because every participant sensed that the conversation had transcended technical compliance and entered the terrain of political philosophy. In Washington, those moments are rare, but when they happen, they reverberate well beyond the chamber walls. Schiff leaned into a line of reasoning that focused on institutional memory, noting that public confidence in the Department of Justice has fluctuated dramatically across administrations and that such fluctuations often stem from perceived uneven application of authority. He framed his argument as preventative rather than accusatory, emphasizing that explicit reaffirmation of ethical compliance could fortify the department against future allegations of bias. McDonald responded by reinforcing that ethical compliance is not dependent on congressional prompting, but is embedded within internal operational structures that predate any specific administration. The contrast between external reassurance and internal confidence defined this phase of the exchange. Schiff was advocating visible accountability. McDonald was advocating structural continuity. Here is a question that viewers should consider carefully. When lawmakers demand explicit affirmation of compliance during high-profile hearings, are they strengthening public trust through visibility? Or are they inadvertently amplifying suspicion by implying that such affirmation is necessary? Conversely, when officials rely on established institutional norms without tailoring their answers to political optics, are they protecting procedural integrity or risking misinterpretation in an environment hungry for clarity? This tension reflects the broader struggle between perception and procedure that defines modern oversight. Schiff's approach assumed that perception shapes legitimacy. McDonald's approach assumed that legitimacy must be rooted in procedure regardless of perception. At one point, Schiff observed that oversight exists precisely because even well-intentioned institutions can drift when scrutiny weakens, a comment that carried historical resonance without naming specific examples. McDonald countered by emphasizing that drift is precisely what internal compliance mechanisms are designed to prevent, suggesting that external pressure does not replace internal governance. The exchange was polite but pointed, each man articulating a worldview about how power should be monitored and constrained. Observers could sense that neither side intended to escalate rhetorically, yet neither intended to retreat intellectually. This is what a disciplined political confrontation looks like when both participants understand the stakes. There was even a restrained flash of irony when Schiff remarked that sometimes the simplest answers are the most reassuring, prompting a few knowing smiles in the gallery. McDonald responded that reassurance must not come at the expense of accuracy, a line delivered with calm precision that underscored his commitment to institutional framing. The subtle humor did not lighten the mood so much as humanize the participants, reminding viewers that even high-stakes constitutional disputes unfold between individuals navigating immense pressure. Schiff's tone suggested urgency rooted in democratic vigilance. McDonald's tone suggested caution rooted in bureaucratic responsibility. As this stage progressed, Schiff widened the aperture further, suggesting that transparency about internal working groups could prevent future misunderstandings about their purpose or scope. McDonald reiterated that the group's mandate involved reviewing prior practices and ensuring compliance moving forward, emphasizing reformative rather than retaliatory intent. Schiff subtly implied that perception of political targeting could arise if communication remained guarded. McDonald subtly implied that excessive public commentary could distort the group's technical mission. The clash became less about specific answers and more about how information should flow between branches of government. Another uncomfortable but necessary question surfaces here. In an era where political narratives form within minutes on social media, can institutions afford to rely solely on internal assurance, or must they adapt their communication style to prevent misinterpretation? Schiff's stance suggested adaptation is essential to maintaining legitimacy in a skeptical age. McDonald's stance suggested adaptation must not compromise procedural neutrality. The broader debate about transparency in modern governance was playing out in real time before a national audience. As the questioning neared its close, Schiff emphasized that oversight is not an attack, but a constitutional duty, reminding viewers that robust scrutiny strengthens rather than weakens democratic institutions. McDonald affirmed that cooperation with oversight is equally a duty, but that cooperation must operate within legal and procedural boundaries designed to protect sensitive processes. The final exchange of this segment did not resolve the tension, yet it clarified the philosophical divide in unmistakable terms. Schiff positioned himself as a guardian of visible accountability. McDonald positioned himself as a steward of institutional continuity. If you have followed this debate carefully, you can see that what began as a dispute over a yes or no answer has become a larger meditation on how transparency, accountability, and procedural discipline interact in a polarized democracy. Before forming a definitive judgment, consider whether your instinct favors visible affirmation in moments of scrutiny or structural assurance grounded in established norms. Civic responsibility requires us to examine both instincts honestly rather than reflexively siding with familiar political affiliations. Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments, because democratic engagement thrives when citizens debate ideas rather than personalities. And if you appreciate analysis that unpacks the strategic dimensions of power without resorting to sensationalism, make sure to stay engaged, because the final phase of this confrontation examines what this exchange signals about the future of congressional oversight and executive branch interaction in the years ahead. As this confrontation reached its final stage, the atmosphere in the chamber shifted from active engagement to reflective tension, because everyone present understood that no decisive victory had occurred. Yet, something consequential had nonetheless taken place. Schiff had pressed with disciplined intensity, framing his insistence on direct affirmation as an essential guardrail against ambiguity in a time when institutional credibility is fragile. McDonald had resisted with measured consistency, maintaining that procedural integrity cannot be compressed into rhetorical shortcuts without risking distortion. The exchange ended not with fireworks, but with a lingering question about what accountability should look like in a polarized republic. And sometimes, in Washington, the absence of resolution is the most revealing outcome of all. Schiff's closing posture emphasized that oversight is not a personal contest, but a constitutional function designed to preserve public trust in federal authority. He suggested that when questions go unanswered in the format requested, the vacuum left behind will inevitably be filled by speculation, whether justified or not. McDonald countered by reiterating that speculation must not be permitted to override disciplined governance, because institutions cannot operate effectively if they bend to the pressure of optics. The philosophical divide was unmistakable. Schiff sought visible clarity. McDonald defended procedural discipline. At the heart of this debate lies a fundamental question about modern democracy. Should elected officials prioritize public perception when conducting oversight, ensuring that answers are delivered in the clearest and most direct format possible, even if nuance is sacrificed? Or should executive officials prioritize contextual completeness, trusting that institutional safeguards will withstand public impatience? This is not a question about personalities alone, but about how constitutional balance is maintained in a media environment that thrives on binary narratives. Schiff leaned toward communicative transparency as a tool of trust building. McDonald leaned toward institutional continuity as the bedrock of legitimacy. There was a subtle final moment when Schiff remarked that history often judges institutions not by their internal confidence, but by their public accountability, a statement that resonated beyond the immediate hearing. McDonald replied that history also judges institutions by their adherence to rule of law rather than political momentum, grounding his position in legal continuity. Neither man accused the other of bad faith. Neither conceded the philosophical ground he occupied. The exchange concluded with the chairman moving the hearing forward, yet the implications continued to echo. For viewers watching from outside the chamber, the confrontation offered a revealing glimpse into the mechanics of power rather than a dramatic unveiling of wrongdoing. It demonstrated how oversight operates not as a theatrical spectacle alone, but as a structured tension between branches designed to test resilience and integrity. Schiff's persistence underscored the importance of visible scrutiny in times of political mistrust. McDonald's steadiness underscored the importance of procedural boundaries in times of political pressure. The clash was less about who prevailed and more about how governance adapts under scrutiny. Another critical question deserves reflection as this narrative closes. When institutions are challenged publicly, do they strengthen through confrontation, or do they risk erosion when dialogue turns into symbolic standoffs? Schiff appeared to believe that pressure clarifies purpose. McDonald appeared to believe that composure protects purpose. Both perspectives reveal an underlying commitment to democratic continuity, even if they differ sharply on method. What this final phase makes clear is that accountability in a constitutional system is rarely resolved through a single exchange. It unfolds gradually, shaped by repeated questioning, institutional response, and public interpretation over time. Schiff leaves this confrontation having reinforced his identity as an unyielding interrogator of executive authority. McDonald leaves having reinforced his identity as a disciplined steward of institutional process. The audience is left to evaluate which approach better safeguards the long-term health of the Republic. If this analysis has illuminated the deeper layers beneath what might otherwise appear to be a simple procedural disagreement, then it has served its purpose. Civic engagement requires more than reacting to moments of tension. It requires examining the principles and incentives that drive those moments. Before forming a final judgment about Schiff or McDonald, ask yourself which framework of accountability you believe most effectively preserves democratic legitimacy in an era of heightened polarization. Share your perspective thoughtfully and respectfully, because robust democracy depends on informed citizens willing to debate ideas without descending into caricature. And if you value detailed, balanced analysis that explores the architecture of political power rather than sensational headlines, stay engaged and continue this conversation, because the health of democratic institutions ultimately rests not only on elected officials and career prosecutors, but on the vigilance and discernment of the public itself.